I'm so glad that tonight we have as our guest a special guest, a dear friend of mine and a great inspiration, Richard Sennett. Before I give the word to Richard, let me just briefly introduce our guest and also the reason why we invited him. As you probably know, those of you who are watching us now live on YouTube and later also, this is the time, unprecedented time in human history when more than 2 billion people are in one way or the other way confined at home. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people are working from home. Public events such as theater events, sports, concerts, even coffee shops, cafes, and so on are shut down for the next months. Who knows how long this will take. And these are just some of the reasons why we invited Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett is professor of sociology at London of Economics. He was one of the founding directors of the New York Institute for Humanities, which included many famous fellows such as Susan Sontag, Michel Foucault, and many others. Richard Sennett is also author of many acclaimed books, from The Fall of Public Man, 1977, to The New Culture of Capitalism, Together, Craftsman, Authority. It's difficult to name all these books. We would need the whole show just to name all the books. But most of this work has been dealing with various topics which bring us directly into the current moment of the global pandemics. Topics such as public space, public life, work, cities, urban environments, and many other aspects of our lives, economies, and societies which are rapidly changing today. So without further introduction, hello, Richard. I'm really glad that you're joining us today.
Hello, I'm really glad to talk to you. It's always a pleasure, even under these rather testing circumstances. And I hope this will be more of a conversation than a one-man, one-person diatribe. I did want to say that the things that really concern me about this are both political and also urban. Maybe that's the best place to start, is to start with the city. Mm-hmm. For the last 5 years, when I retired from teaching, I unretired immediately and went to work for the United Nations on a project about cities and climate change, how cities are going to adapt to that and deal with it. And the advent of the COVID-19 virus has changed a lot of the thinking that my group has been doing about cities, because they're in some ways the health crisis that we're having now reinforces issues that we were dealing with before it, like the burning of plastic waste, which is both horrible for people's health and a terrible cause of pollution in the atmosphere. But there are other ways in which a healthy city is not necessarily a green city. And that set of issues focuses around density. For a green city, for instance, you want to cram as many people as you can onto public transport. For a healthy city, not just today, but in the aftermath of this, that might not be the way to get people around. We should never go back to the, car economy of people in gasoline engines and so on. But there are lots of things that we need to sort of rethink about how to be green, which are difficult. Another area that we're thinking about is housing. In New York City, the 17-story housing towers are a very efficient way to deal with energy use in the environment. But to have 70 or 80 people using 1 or 2 elevators crowded together is not such a good idea. So the question becomes, how can we get forms of density which don't put people at risk of that kind of exposure? At this point, I don't have any answer to these. I wish I did. But it's a lot of the work that we've been doing for the COP26, which has been, as you know, been delayed because of the pandemic, has given us it's given us pause to think about how the recommendations we want to make about developing cities can be squared with, this is not the last pandemic any of us are ever going to see. You know, in 10, 12, 15 years, there'll be another one, you know, and the question is how to build something that's sustainable along these two frameworks. So that's something that's very much more than my own work. That's something that's been really on my mind these last weeks.
I would definitely love to talk about your work, and we can come back to it a bit later, but let me touch upon what you just mentioned, because you, as the chairman of the United Nations Habitat Urban Initiatives Program, as you said, you're dealing with these questions, and the current global pandemics has this kind of contradictory, confronts us with this kind of contradictory situation, where on the one hand you need a healthy city, but as you said, it's not necessarily green. And as you said, there are many scientists today saying not only that this is not the last pandemics, but that the future pandemics might be even worse, precisely because of the economic system, namely neoliberalism, which ruining habitat, and then because of that, climate crisis, ruining the nature, extinction of species, the viruses are jumping from animals to humans and so on. And this is basically just one of the coronaviruses which exists. So who knows what is next? So my question is, how do you imagine now during this pause, as you said, break, the future city, okay, if it's not public transport in the way we imagined it today, what kind of transport would it be? Also, if I may also touch upon one of the last episodes when we had Saskia Sassen here as a guest, she was advocating more localism instead of very densely populated cities and so on. Is perhaps that also a solution, that people might leave cities and create different environments? Or if we stick to the cities, how do you imagine the future of the city faced with a future global pandemic?
We've asked me a huge set of questions. You always do this.
But we have 1 hour, so.
We have an hour, so yeah. That's good. Well, to take the last issue first, one of the reasons cities exist is that when you put a lot of different activities and people together, you get what economists call agglomeration effects. In a suburb, if you've got one shopping center and lots of houses, you don't have much of an economic engine. It's not, if you have, as Microsoft does in the suburbs of Seattle, people don't get that kind of stimulus that they get in a city from being with lots of startups competing and colluding and all of that. So the notion of getting rid of cities, of de-densifying them, is economically not such a good idea. And socially, of course, is a disaster, because what you want people to do is be exposed to differences, different ways of life, different ethnicities, races, and so on. So to me, the issue is not whether to have less dense environments, but how to deal with that. One proposal by the mayor of Paris is what she calls walking density. That is to try and redo cities so that there are these nodes which are dense, but you can walk to them within 15 minutes, so you don't have to take public transport, and that the nodes then relate to each other electronically and so on. And that's a good idea. It would mean a scale of investment that I think very few capitalists are prepared to make. You'd have to imagine Paris. If you were to make it an entirely walking city like that, you'd have to reimagine the whole infrastructure of the city. It's not to say anything about its politics, anything like that. But that is a possibility. That one of the ways to do this is simply to do away with the idea of one center, which is regulated by mass transit. There's a slight problem with that, which I just want to signal. That's a solution of privilege. I mean, the places that my team and I are working in, like Mexico City, if you live, you know, in a poor part of Mexico City, a poor barrio Mexico City, your work is three and a half hours away, and by foot, it's ridiculous, you know? You'd have to, in that case, reconfigure the whole structure of economy so that it actually, somebody would invest in putting that factory in the midst of your locality where you could get there. So I've felt this a lot about pedestrian solutions. They are for people, they're great, but in the developing world, it's a solution of privilege. And so the question is really a much more fundamental one about economic reorganization so that poor people can actually get access to their work. In traditional kinds of slums, a word I don't like Dharavi in Mumbai, people, many of the people there lived and worked on the same street. They did very primary kinds of production, basket weaving, cooking, and so on. So that the idea of a pedestrian city made sense. But Dharavi had one of the highest rates because it's so concentrated and there's so much happening in a small space. It had one of the highest rates of diseases in Mumbai and Bombay. So, you know, again, that's where you get into this difficulty about this. I really look at this, I say this to you as an individual, not as an employee of the UN. This is really a crisis of neoliberalism, because the Anglo-Saxon neoliberal regimes, like the US primarily, and to a lesser extent, places like Australia and Britain, are proving themselves absolutely incapable of mobilizing resources against this. And that's because the neoliberal regimes made warfare on the idea of a welfare state. They wanted to privatize all of it. And I think what we're seeing here is a natural experiment in, it's as though it's like a boomerang, you know, and having destroyed these basic safety net support, now they're going to be really menaced by it, which is terrible for most of the people in the US who were on the receiving end of this neoliberalist political economy rather than its directors. But I really think that the countries, the US is going to have the hardest time in the world of all major developed societies in dealing with the pandemic, because it's been the most brutal in its attack on the welfare state. That's what neoliberalism does. So just I'm sorry, I'm having a political rant here. But I mean, I think for cities, the thing that we're going to have to figure out, which follows on from that, is how to create urban economies which give us the benefits of agglomeration, but overcome the problems, the density problem that agglomeration brings. And density is a technical subject, you know, how you orchestrate a crowd, how it moves, whether it's static, how much space people have in it. And it's an aesthetic problem. What kind of theater is a healthy theater now? You know, I certainly don't believe that online broadcasts are going to replace clubs or cafes, you know, but we may have to reconfigure, say, their size, for instance. And I mean, there are lots of knock-ons about this, which are focused on this particular problem, which is how do you design density?
Mm-hmm. Before I come back to the public life and this new online life, and whether it will be, you know, a compensation for the public life we had before and for how long it will last, I would love to come back to what you just said. You know, on the one hand, what you can see is that, you know, a city which would be a walking city, as you said, for Paris, would be a kind of utopia, I would say, at least for the people who are living in that city, who are privileged.
Very costly utopia, yeah.
Yes, but on the other side, what the crisis has shown, what it has shown, the current global pandemics, besides the necessity of public infrastructure, public healthcare, and so on, it also shows another trend, which is the complete contrary opposition of the utopian walkable city. What you have now is a sort of dystopian walkable city in the city, precisely Paris, where you have this kind of restrictions of movement. You cannot really go out of a zone of several square kilometers. And what is happening as well in most of the European countries now, it happened in China to a much higher degree, is this kind of surveillance capitalism integrating inside. I mean, it existed before with the concept of the smart city, but what we can see now is that the global pandemics becomes a kind of excuse, beautiful legitimacy for imposing more new surveillance measures, from geolocation tracking, restriction of movement. So my question is, how do you see this trend developing? Are we going to wake up once we come out of self-isolation in a few months, for instance, in a city which will radically transform into a dystopian city, which will be completely surveilled? How do you see it?
Well, I think, this is a general social problem, that crises are opportunities for power to expand its scope even after the crisis ends. And that goes back to the Greeks during the Peloponnesian War. You know, it's a kind of sociological constant that power tries to normalize the measures that it gets for control during a crisis. Mm-hmm. And that's a political issue that I think we need to absolutely, that's the politics of post-pandemic, mm-hmm. which is how to fight back against that kind of surveillance. One of the interesting things, you mentioned surveillance cameras and so on. I mean, one of the interesting things to me about this is I always thought this was George Orwell come to life, you know? In fact, the resistance to this in China, which is the home of all of this with this facial recognition and stuff, is the strongest political resistance they've had in years. And I don't think people, I took heart from that, because I don't think people are just passive victims of high tech. And I think the world of these cameras is going to be a kind of, it's going to be a kind of a point of political struggle. The problem, I mean, there are lots of problems with them. I mean, the Chinese use of them is horrific. But in smart cities, which have tried to use a lot of camera tech, like Masdar in the Emirates, or even London, which has a zillion cameras, problem is information overload. And they pass a point in which the information is really computable in any kind of practical sense. The Chinese haven't passed that point, and because they haven't passed it, there's been this huge struggle emerging about it. But I think that here it's a different kind of issue, which is it's surveillance without intelligence. It's just more and more raw data, more data than anybody knows how to compute. And so we're on the other side of that curve. But I still think it's, what I'm trying to say is that either way, either if it's Orwell or pre-Orwell, this to me seems the politics of high tech at this point, how to turn off the cameras, you know? And it could be, you could do it. I mean, it's very simple to turn off a camera, you know? You can take a huge industrial scissors and destroy them, you know? And I think it's going to be that kind of politics of tech that we're going to see around this, more than following people on the internet. Mm-hmm. That's my own view. Mm-hmm. This is the flashpoint.
Let's talk about the public space and the internet, since you're the author of a book which was very important for me when I was studying philosophy in Zagreb, and for many other students, The Fall of Public Man, which was originally published in 1977, seems like
40 years ago.
Yes, it's like ages ago. And what you describe in the book, you know, for covering the 18th century, 19th century cities such as Paris, London, European cities mainly, and the culture of public space in public theaters, but also the cafe cultures and so on. It seems that, I don't know whether you would agree, I mean, you have been dealing with this obviously very deeply. Is it for the first time in human history that we are facing this kind of situation which we are facing now, that all these public spaces are basically shut down, they are empty, they are not working, and so many people are basically having this kind of online life as we have tonight?
Yeah, I don't think it's one or the other. I mean, I'm actually, it might surprise you, I think the advent of things like Zoom is a very good thing, because there's a real limit to face-to-face, which is you have to be where the other person is. And the notion that you can have some kind of communication which is, you know, visual as well as audio, across distances of 1,000 or 10,000 miles seems to me great. The question with that kind of tech is how it's used and how people use it in a cooperative way. The tech is an instrument, just the way the camera is an instrument. You don't have to turn the camera on to facial recognition, you know? But I think this is I'm really an enthusiast about this, and particularly about the forms of online communication like Zoom, in which a lot of people can be included. But it's not one or the other. There are some things that face-to-face and embodied, you know, relations between people can never be replaced. But this is an addition to it. And I think it's something very, very, very positive as a tool. This was, you know that I started out life as a musician.
I know you are a cello player, right?
Yeah, I still am, even now. And there was some way in which I really thought that the recording, I mean, I started recording in the age of tape. That's how old I am. But the tape cassettes and then CDs were kind of wonderful, and particularly DVDs were kind of wonderful, that you get a kind of, you're not physically there, but you get a kind of proximity to seeing people on the stage, seeing what they're doing, which was great. And it relieves a lot of the, for some people, I didn't suffer from it because I'm a ham, but some people, you know, don't play as well in a performance as they do when they play for themselves, all of that kind of stuff. There are ways in which using technology expressively is fabulous. And what we're going to, you know, I think as a result of the kinds of things that have developed in the crisis, we'll just learn how to use what's appropriate for what. I'd much rather see any opera online than pay the hundreds of pounds to go sit in a little seat in the opera where you can barely see anything, you know? So you know, it's a new tool of expression as well as communication. So the fall of public men, with what it refers to as an image, is the notion of withdrawal from other people. It's an inward turn. It's the notion that you are alone with yourself, even when you are in the midst of other people. And that's something that I think is really a phenomenon that happened, that is a crisis that happened in the 19th century and came to fruition in the 20th. And it's the replacement, if you like, of sociability by subjectivities. You're going to put it in a stupid way like that. So, you know, the tool we're using is a liberation from that, in my view.
But but it can be, as you said, it can be both.
Of course, but it's not a negative. The notion that people are condemned to use tech the way a lot of people do when they get on chat rooms and one person gets negative and then it's just, you know, name calling. The technology doesn't do that.
You know? Yeah, but my concern is another concern, which is, you know, you mentioned Zoom. We are using Zoom now at this moment, but during the last days, there have been many concerns, for instance, precisely about Zoom, that it's not so public as we thought, that it arrives directly at the table of the National Security Agency, NSA, in the United States. So my fear and concern is, yesterday we had a great episode with Renata Villa and Sasha Savanovic about what they call digital colonialism and the prospects of a kind of new technological barbarism.
Absolutely, that's real. All I'm saying is that the answer to that is not to use the tech. The answer to that is to find ways where they can't get at it. And we'll find those ways, you know. There are ways to be shielded from that kind of surveillance. I teach at MIT now, and an amazing place for me to be. And you know, people shield themselves all the time from surveillance on online chats and things like that. It's doable technically. This is a political problem, not a problem of the machine, in my view.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because what you can see is that neoliberalism again, and what is called platform capitalism, is using the crisis in order to
do more of this. Yeah,
because
absolutely.
Yeah, my fear is that, now this is a public space, let's say so, it is transmitted on YouTube, people are watching us, it's completely for free, so it's free education and so on. But we are using a platform which is a private company, which has obviously some murky connections to the deep state of United States.
Yeah.
This is a problem. What if this crisis will be used, that these spaces now, which we perceive as public, are already privatized, even if many of the people don't know it yet, that they are actually not public in the sense of a public theater, which is owned by the state, financed by public money, open ideally to everyone, and so on. That's...
Yeah, well, that's a real fear. I mean, one of the things that it might spawn is a kind of communication. My friend James Scott has studied this among slaves, where you get a kind of hidden level of, slaves had no protection against being surveilled, but they developed a kind of language which was very difficult for their masters to read. Maybe we'll develop something like that. Who knows with it? I mean, the problem with this is it's the problem of corporate capitalism. When you have 5 or 6 huge tech companies, every other tech company looks at that as what they should become. What if Zoom, for instance, were deprivatized, or an alternative to Zoom, which was run like Mozilla Firefox or DuckDuckGo, which are, there are ways to do tech which doesn't feed into this kind of monopoly tech stream. So maybe you have to find another. I'm too old to create it, but there must be another way to reinvent this tool so that it's resistant.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell you why I'm so on this. It's a little the same thing that I'm feeling very much about the media reporting of this crisis, which is, I think, very exploitative, because it's as though the media gets more of a reach by exciting panic and fear and so on. And, this is a real serious crisis. The last way to deal with it is by saying, my God, another 500 people died yesterday. This is the future we're all done for. That's a good way to keep journalists in work. But there has to be a kind of, it's serious, there has to be a kind of sobriety about it. And the same thing, it seems to me, is true of tech, which is, rather than say, this is the devil's instrument, or Bill Gates, let's say he's a half devil instrument, is to say, okay, this is a real serious problem, let's solve it. Let's create the equivalent of DuckDuckGo or Firefox, something like that. I guess maybe it's because I'm so old. I'm sort of resistant to the notion of crisis as something that is a moment when truth comes out. It's almost infantile to me, A crisis is just that. It's a difficulty, serious difficulty that you have to face calmly and so on. So, I mean, a lot of the left has lived off demonizing tech, now they're demonizing quite rightly governments like the US government or even the British government. But the answer is not to see this as apocalyptic.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think that's not how you get through life.
Yeah, I have a connecting question to this because besides The Fall of Public Man, you've also written two books. many more, but two which I find particularly useful in this moment of a global pandemics. One is craftsman, and one is together. You know, and I really love these passages in Craftsman where you talk about the skills which were created under the NHS, and in which way, you know, a public sector which was public, a common good, was reinforcing social cooperation. Unlike the current system, what you can see in the UK now, you know, once you privatize it, quantify it, and so on, then you're actually not able anymore.
You weakened it, yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, do you think that this situation, you know, if you just look at the numbers, sorry to use a quantifying tool, but if you look at the numbers of millions of people who are now at home using the online space, do you think it will create new sorts of social cooperation? Will it reinforce social cooperation? Even if on the other hand, there is this surveillance and privatization coming, do you see that as a potential possibility of an emancipation and more social cooperation?
I do. Yeah, I do. It means that you can cooperate, particularly using chats like this rather than email, which is really a devilish device of control. But using communication tools like this, people who can cooperate are people who are very, very far from each other. You know, I have a student, Shani Orgad, is a wonderful sociologist who studied, for instance, the way in which women who had breast cancer set up a kind of international network to share information, things they weren't getting from their doctors, you know, all of that sort of stuff. And they developed skills which, skills of communication which were incredible, which were not just sharing horror stories, but tell me what you have and I'll tell you what my experience of this was. Now, this was all this is 5 years ago, that is pre-video. But even more than, the video makes it even more possible. I mean, the thing is, the whole thing about cooperation is that it's informal and it's context dependent. And we're in a situation now where that informality and context dependent stuff doesn't require being in one place, you know? And that to me seems an incredible possibility to exploit. It's a technical thing. It's also the notion that you would use high tech as a kind of workshop for the left. It's very, I don't know. I think it's a kind of, I don't know how it is for you in DiEM, but I certainly feel that with the British left, that it's always sort of pushed tech to the background. It's obsessed with the notion of class, you know, which is, you know, it's an inequality, but extremes of inequality. And it did very little thinking about solidarity. It assumed that solidarity came out of anger at injustice, and that injustice begets, the anger at injustice begets solidarity. It's not true. You know, solidarity is a craft. That's what my books are about. And it's something that now is a craft with a new tool, which is what we're doing. So I really think one of the things that I hope comes out of this time is that the left thinks less about Piketty and more, I don't know, more about internet, you know, left-wing internet gurus, you know. We have to do something which isn't this usual notion of assuming that rage begets solidarity. It's not going to get us anywhere now. Anyhow, that's my feeling about this. Yeah, what would you say?
I can see, Richard, we are getting questions from the people who are watching us on the live stream. So one of the questions, someone is asking you, will the COVID crisis be used as a reason to justify fascism, like in Hungary and in other Western European member states?
The answer is yes.
Can I pose you another question from me?
The answer is yes. Of course they will. It's a golden opportunity.
But let me ask you then, because I know I came across one very interesting detail from your biography, which is that your father and your uncle were fighting in the Spanish Civil War. They were part of the international brigades.
Okay. Yeah.
So to connect to this question from someone from YouTube, if the answer is yes, do you think, what are the possibilities for creating a new, maybe even online international brigades? If fascism is our future, how do you see it? And what would be the difference from the historical international brigades from the Spanish Civil War? Could you perhaps imagine?
Well, the thing about the International Brigade, just as a background note to it, is that most of the people who went into it as Communist Party members and left Spain as anarcho-syndicalists, as anarchists. And that was certainly true for my uncle and my dad, that they were good party members, they believed in the revolutionary vanguards, etc. And they came out of it thinking that this was, particularly after the Hitler-Stalin pact. Mm-hmm. My uncle told me he was just on the outskirts of Barcelona fighting kind of last ditch thing, and he heard about this Hitler-Stalin pact. And he said, another piece of fascist propaganda. Anyhow, that's what happened to it. The reason I say this is that I think maybe what we need to do is have a lot more inquiry into how, rather than having a movement, we have lots of movements, which, like a Venn diagram, lots of different Venn diagrams about this. I'm very resistant to, and I've always been, to manifestos. The only good to them is, it seems to me, that they're so outrageous that people begin deconstructing them and taking them apart. I don't think the left should have a position. That's what the dominant powers have. That's called hegemony. Hegemony is having a position. And I think we need a different kind of politics now. Your generation needs to find a way to have lots of different workshops rather than a church, So, and again, that's why I like all these interest groups which are online together with each other. They don't fit neatly together. That's fine. When Saskia and I lived in New York, the big debate among a lot of left-wing people in New York was, how can we mesh identity politics with a critique of capitalism? And it seemed to me crazy. Why mesh them? They don't have to fit together. I mean, it's like anything in life. If it's complex, it's got its own distinct identity. Mm-hmm. You can be like me, a middle-class white lefty, without subscribing to various forms of identity politics. I'm not Black. I'm never going to be Black, so far as I know. That's not my struggle. I'm sympathetic to it. But the notion that it all has to fit into one big package is, I think, a very, very a temptation which the left still succumbing to, rather than learning the lesson that the aftermath of communism is anarchism, rather than the precursor.
So is your vision of it perhaps closer to Foucault's concept of heterotopia? Like this kind of, yeah?
You know that he and I wrote together for a decade. So
I know. That's why I'm asking.
You fed me this question like a piece of cheese to a mouse. Yes, exactly. That was a very prescient idea. And I think if Michel had lived longer, that after he'd finished these books on sexuality and power, that he would have gone back to it. It was also, I have to say, the idea of Derrida, his great enemy, you know, which is a kind of, you know, all of this goes, heterotopia, you know, it's our old friend, goes back to the 30s and so on. But it gets pushed aside by the notion of there is a left, you know, so, as I say, I probably won't live to see this, but it's what I think the left has to be. It shouldn't have a program. It should have a procedure.
I'd love to discuss this with you, but I don't want to monopolize the space because we have questions addressed to you. And we will have a chance to discuss it, and you will live long enough, I'm promising you, because this crisis is accelerating everything so much that who knows what we will see in a few months.
Yeah, that's true.
One question is, what do you think, you mentioned the Chinese, what do you think of the reaction of the Chinese public after their opening back up from coronavirus lockdown? Is there revolutionary potential in that?
The answer is I don't know.
Fair enough. I also don't know. Yeah.
Ask me something else.
Okay, someone says, hi Richard, I'm writing about London's #London is opened brand ATM. How do you expect the branded open neoliberal city we see evoked again and again to be maintained despite surveillance intensification?
Well, what I take out of open is neoliberal, because neoliberal is closed. It has an ideology of individualism, but the control mechanisms are very enclosed. I mean, I think that the thing is that I think people, and it's a privilege we have in the West, and we shouldn't scorn it, that the impulse, the impulse in everyday civil society to live in an open way is pretty strong for us. And it doesn't come out of neoliberalism. It comes out of a kind of localized sociability. And that's certainly true in London, you know, which is, it doesn't have a dominant culture. And I mean, the whole thing about sociability is that it's something which is particular to a relationship between two people, and any kind of sociability is. And we've been privileged to have a form of it in which those two people can be strangers to each other. That's not been true for our Chinese friends, you know? Their sociability has been rigidly controlled so that that doesn't happen. But for us, it has been a possibility. And I think that's, again, that's something which has this anarchic element, communitarian, without being, you know, claustrophobic element to it. Mm-hmm. And that's, I don't know, you know, I don't know, it sounds soppy, but what I want to do is put the social back in socialism, back into socialism. Mm-hmm. You know, that's been my project, how to put the social back into socialism.
There is precisely a question which might be connected to that. Coronavirus showed the so-called free market cannot solve it all. Right. And governments around the world have to solve economical problems. So someone is asking, is there a shift towards socialism that can be useful? Perhaps you can explain what does it mean to bring back the social into socialism, and do you think this current crisis might evoke it and reinforce it?
Okay, I'll tell you what it would mean in terms of the NHS, the health service here, right, which give you very concrete to that. The cleaners and the nurses in the NHS were subject to a regime where they were asked constantly to move from ward to ward, from task to task, where their skills were thought to be so primitive that they weren't really credited as having anything to do with as human beings, with the care of patients. Now what people are discovering in the NHS as a result of this is that people who really know what's happening for these people in horrible distress are the people who are cleaning up, who are the night nurses. They're not the doctors, you know, who are the supervising doctors. And there's been, in the last couple of weeks, a kind of huge reevaluation of the role of those people, with the knock-on effect that because most of those people are foreigners and have been menaced by this regime, go away, we only want high-skilled people. Suddenly, that's no longer an operative kind of thing. And the social skills are probably in a way more important than the social skills of the Secretary of State for medicine. So what we're seeing here is that the right has dropped its anti-foreigner thing completely. And now it's thinking, my God, how can we get these people back to be in the system? Oh, I don't like you doing that.
I'm sorry, it's not Corona.
Use your elbow, yeah.
Like this.
Yeah, very good. But you understand what I mean? I mean, things follow from that. Once you start asking, what are the actual social skills needed in a crisis like this? A different kind of picture of social relations forms, and that has a knock-on effect on things that seem to have no relation to disease, like immigration policy. And that's what the Brits, who are very slow learners, I must say, in 2 weeks, they've had an accelerated course in the perils of nationalism. Mm. Now, will this happen in Hungary? Who knows? He certainly, Orban would certainly like to prevent that. But if enough people get sick in Hungary and they can't deal with it, maybe the same thing will happen there. But my point about this is that when you start with the social, you sort of work out to the political. Mm-hmm. The social is not a consequence of the political. In my view, it's the other way around. And that's what Michel's notion of heterodoxy was about. You start with the social relationship, not with the scopic regime. The regime gets challenged by the social relationship. That's also James Scott, who's probably the world's greatest anarchist philosopher at this moment, although he hates that if people say that about it. But that's the notion of this, that if you work socialism from the social out, you arrive at the political.
Mm-hmm. There is also a question referring to something you mentioned already before, saying that the left shouldn't have this kind of universal one common program. And someone is asking, and you mentioned a common procedure. So the question is from someone watching us at YouTube, and hi to everyone. Thanks for watching us. The question is, what do you mean by a common procedure for the left?
What I mean is a set of, if I can say it, a set of ideas about how to develop social skills. I mean, I don't want to give a whole spiel about this, but I'll give you an example about this. When I go to meetings, political meetings, and I hear one person arguing with another person, they always use the declarative voice. I believe, I think, so on. There's never a space opened for a different kind of speech, which is a speech about ambiguity. Like, I would have thought, or perhaps. The conversation always becomes declarative rather than subjunctive. If I were running those meetings, I seldom am, the notion, well, actually, I've done that at the UN. I've said, okay, your position is very clear. What's wrong with your position to you? That is to get more self-doubt, more subject questioning, more ambiguity into something. That's political. That's not a weakening of politics. That's a creation of a social bond, because the other has an opportunity to say, oh, okay, I'm worried about just that you're uncertain about.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that a lot of these discursive rules about how to be together, which are that kind of procedure. I don't like voting for that reason on the left. What does it matter if a majority of people think one thing or another?
Yeah,
why is a majority more right, 51% more right than 49%? And also, it leads to a false notion that something is resolved by taking a vote.
Mm-hmm.
And life's too complex for that. So I just think we have to be different kinds of animals on the left. We have to be much, much more interactive and communicative rather than clear, defensible, robust position, all of that kind of junk. That leave that to the right. That's what belongs to them.
You mentioned how to be together, which reminded me on our last physical meeting in Zagreb. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
When we were talking about another dear friend of yours and my huge inspiration in my theoretical work, who is Roland Barthes. At his last lectures at Collège de France, he was precisely talking about how to live together. And he invented this term, I don't know how to say it in English, idiorhythmus, that you can live together.
It doesn't exist in English.
Yeah, you see, that's why I don't know how to pronounce it. In Croatian, it makes sense, idiorhythmia, which is kind of idios in the sense of your own, and rhythmos as a rhythm of a community. So do you think that this is what you were just saying, that we have to reinvent in the ways, not just how we cooperate, but how we live together and how different rhythms of living together can actually come together in order to create a community Roland Barthes was talking about?
Yes, I was also very inspired by him. He's a terrible pianist, but he was an inspiring writer. And, that's, by the way, you hear outside people clapping for the NHS.
That's what I can hear now.
Can you hear it?
Yes. Yeah. Although I must say I have a small problem with it. I mean, I love it when people clap, but I would love them to not vote for those people who privatized the NHS in the first place.
Yeah, well, I hope those days are over. But that's that notion, it's the same, Roland's notion is the same thing as Foucault's, that being together doesn't mean being on the same page. And how to manage that relationship is, to me, radical.
Yeah, I think the left could learn a lot about it, because the left has very often problems how to be together with those who don't share the same opinion and so on. Yeah.
Disaster. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyhow, will you send me some of the comments that people have sent to you?
I will. There are more questions, but unfortunately we have to finish. These are really past quickly. And I hope we reconnect again. Perhaps just one last question from me, out of pure curiosity. What are you working on now at the moment? What kind of topics are you exploring in self-isolation?
Well, I'm writing a book which is about performing and power. And it's really a book about it's called Teatro Mundi, and it's about what the relationship between expression and domination.
Thanks. I hope next time we speak about it, it is published in the meantime.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and send me, I'd be interested in people's reactions.
I'll do it immediately after the show.
Okay.
Thanks a lot for being with us. Let me just announce the next episodes for tomorrow. So tomorrow we have a special day. First, we have Angela Richter and Claudia Trapp discussing arts in the time of coronavirus. And then after that, we have Yanis Varoufakis and Brian Eno discussing also the coronavirus crisis. It's completely for free, but if you want, not you, Richard, but you as well, you can donate to DiEM25 because we just depend on donations. We want to keep this program free to create a public space. And thanks a lot, Richard, also for all your work and your books, which were very inspiring for us.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.